Okay, so today we're going to do a bit of a tutorial on the best laws for power structure, but before we do, we actually need to talk about some background concepts in terms of legitimacy, IG approval, authority, and clout, because all of these are important for understanding why which power structure laws are best. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about legitimacy just in general. If we click the government tab, we can see that currently we have an unacceptable government here, and we can just take a look at what this means for us. So an illegitimate government gives us -3 oppo group approval. This is important because when you take a look at the interest groups, you're gonna see that approval rating matters, but it matters different for different interest groups because you get different bonuses and such. But any interest group that goes to -10 will radicalize. You don't want radicals because they create a larger and larger penalty on your interest group approval rating, as well as they can spark a civil war. Okay. You also get increased radicals from standard of living decrease, which again, radicals lead to, if we take a look here, when you have more radicals, and they're going to start decreasing approval rating more and more and more, and so this will create kind of like a snowball effect in terms of people not liking you, and so generally you want to avoid radicals. Okay, if we have an unacceptable government, now you can pass laws. You cannot pass laws with an illegitimate government, so you actually have to avoid this situation pretty harshly if you want any new laws to be passed. Okay, and then you have unacceptable government, which lessens the harshness of the opposition group approval and less radicals, but you get an additional radicals per month. I don't know if you get additional radicals per month over here, but it says radicals all across the country will increase, but here it says it gives you the exact number of radicals that will increase. And so I don't know, I assume that the number on the left is bigger, but I'm not sure exactly how this works. Okay. If we have contested government, you just get -1 opposition group approval. This is a fine place to be. And then if you have legitimate government, you get increased loyalists from standard of living increases. So as long as your standard of living is increasing, this is going to be good. And then for righteous government, you get -50% enactment time, which is huge when you're trying to pass through a bunch of laws. So if you have a bunch of laws you want to pass, having a righteous government is really good. This is really good at the start of the game, and then it starts becoming less useful. Overall, the legitimacy starts becoming a lot less useful during the later portions of the game, because the legitimacy affects the ticking rate at which how fast you pass laws, and so it's good early on, but later on it starts becoming less important. And okay, so the second thing we're going to talk about is IG approval rating. Now, IG approval rating, we already discussed. If you go to -10, you radicalize, but also there's two other really important points, and that's -5 radicalism, or sorry, -5 if approval is important, and then +5 and +10. And the reason why is you have all these different traits that you have for the interest groups. So for example, you have -30% state construction efficiency from the trade unionists, and when they don't approve you. So when they're at -5, when they're at +5, you get industrial organizers, and you also get solidarity at +10. Okay, an important thing to note is that interest groups can be powerful. The powerfulness is denoted by this little extra border where you have all the triangles and this sort of thing. And what this does is it makes it so that you are doubling the bonus. So if we take a look, you see work to rule, it has -30% state construction efficiency. With the interest group powerful, instead you have +100% stronger effect. Okay? Now, if a government is marginalized, they do not apply any of these bonuses. And so if you can keep interest groups that are against you under 5%, this is a good thing. And so we'll get into that in a second, but I just want to really quickly cover all of the interest group bonuses. In general, I think the trade unions have the strongest ones, with industrial organizers, with the manufacturing industry's throughput bonus, and solidarity with the workforce ratio. I think this is by far the strongest interest group to have a high approval rating with, which is why a lot of the more liberal laws are important. And also state construction efficiency is a pretty big malus, especially early on when you were trying to ramp up. Unfortunately, these guys aren't easy to please early on, but they become more so later. Okay, now we have, we're going to take a look at these guys. So military goods cost is not that big a deal. Military tech cost is nice, but you can kind of try and get these guys approval, when you need it and not when you don't. And then patriotic fervor is actually pretty strong with the plus 15% offense and defense, and this will, of course, if you manage to get them powerful, that'll be plus 30, so that'll actually be quite a large bonus to your military. An important thing to note is you can increase slightly the approval rating of the military by paying them high wages. Same with the Petite Bourgeoisie and the Intelligentsia for the same one, but the military wages tend to be a little bit more efficient. Okay. Now we have the Petite Bourgeoisie who gives this, oh, sorry. What did the minus 10 on this? Oh, yeah, military goods cost. Okay, so now we have the Petite Bourgeoisie, which gives minus influence and plus radicals for discrimination when they are unhappy. When they are slightly happy, they give 10% bureaucracy, and when they are really happy, they give decreased loan interest rate. Now, the Petite Bourgeoisie, in my estimation, is actually a pretty weak interest group in terms of these bonuses. You know, minus 20% loan interest rate is actually kind of an interesting one, because running a huge deficit and just spending a whole bunch with the Petite Bourgeoisie is an interesting strategy. And also the 10%, the extra bureaucracy is kind of nice, but what I don't like very much is when you have this bonus, then you lose it, it feels really bad, and all of a sudden you start running this huge, like, problematic stuff, and it's no good. And xenophobia, you know, it's not a good one to have. And so generally speaking, I like to suppress the Petite Bourgeoisie under 5% if possible. Now, let's take a look at the Intelligentsia, which I think is one of the stronger, probably the second strongest group. You get Prestige Malice if they don't like you, at minus 5 or more, and you get minus 10% society tech cost if they like you. In general, I think the tech ones are pretty good. The military one's really, really good if you're fighting, and it's slightly good if you're not fighting too much because of the mil tech cost. Well, let's get back to these guys, and the migration attraction one is huge, especially if they're powerful. We don't have a powerful intelligentsia in this run, but if you have a powerful intelligentsia, that's plus 50% migration attraction. Migration attraction is a huge part of the game for most countries, unless you're like playing China or the British East Indies or the British India Company, whichever one that is, where they have just a ton of pop at the start of the game. This migration attraction is huge. And so having a powerful intelligentsia that is over 20% clout, which is how they get powerful, and a powerful trade union, and having both of them approve you at plus 10 is going to make your economy really strong, because you're going to get increased workforce ratio, 20% throughput bonus, which this is a huge bonus, and you're going to get 50% migration attraction. I think this is kind of the strongest way to play, which means having like a liberal government that caters to the people is really strong. Now let's take a look at the Industrialists, who also have a really strong one, strong bonuses and kind of bad malices. But the thing is they're kind of often at odds with the trade unions, so it's hard to get their support both at the same time early on in the game. Generally speaking, you can go for Industrialists and Intelligentsia combo. I think this is kind of the strong way to play initially, and then you transition to the trade unions. But let's take a look at their bonuses. They give production technology costs. I really, really like this one. I think this one's good, especially early on in the game. You're researching mostly production tech, and you can kind of decide which techs you want to prioritize based on this approval rating. These guys are really mad at us in this run. If we take a look here, we'll come back to that in a second. And then job creators, I think, is also really powerful. It gives increased capitalist investment pool contribution. I'm not sure exactly if this is additive or multiplicative. So, for example, if we have laissez-faire here, this gives 50% capitalist investment pool contribution. I'm not sure if this 10% on top of this is plus 60%, in which case it's additive, or plus 55%, in which case it's multiplicative. In either rate, it's going to be the same if this interest group is powerful, because it's going to be plus 20% would be either 70% or 60%. So it matters whether or not it's multiplicative or additive. I'm not sure exactly how it works, but here we go. Then we have the Catholic Church, which you'll notice a lot of these are good in the way that they kind of jive with the play style of if you're going to have these people powerful. They have minus education access when they are mad, and they have plus authority when they are happy, just slightly happy. And authority we'll get to in a minute, but it is a resource that it tends to be stronger earlier on in the game, and stronger when you have a large population that is not super, super productive. and then it starts falling off when you start having a very productive, high standard of living government, because you'll get less money from, we'll talk about it. Okay. And then birth rate is also pretty good, again, if you have a really large population that's not necessarily very productive. If you have a very productive population and it's not very large, you will benefit more from migration than you do birth rate. If you have a very large population, then the birth rate is actually a pretty big deal. And so balancing these out and thinking about your government a little bit, it is important. Now, it's important to note, if these guys are powerful and happy, these guys probably aren't, the Intelligentsia probably aren't, because they're generally at odds with each other, and the migration attraction is really, really good, unless you're playing as something like China or, Dutch East Indies, not Dutch East Indies, the East India, the British India Trading Company. I forget what I'll stop referencing it. I forget the name. Okay, now let's take a quick look at the rural folk. Minus tech spread is a pretty annoying malice to have. And they also have honest work, which is increased logging industry, agriculture, and ranchers' throughput. This is really, really good late game, which is interesting because late game you can go Council Republic, which we will talk about in a hot minute. But Council Republic empowers both the laborers and the trade unionists. And so you can kind of try and create a situation where you have, let's get back to them, powerful rural folks for this increased logging industry throughput, primarily because late game you tend to run out of hardwood. But this one's pretty good. And then we have the infrastructure bonus from farmers markets, which is pretty powerful. But just like the petite bourgeoisie, middle managers, this increased bureaucracy, it's really annoying when you get these guys happy and then they become not so happy because you just get a huge infrastructure tank everywhere. But this is pretty good as well. So, when you're thinking of how you're going to massage and manage clout to the extent that you can, it's nice to have 3 interest groups be 20%, and then have all the interest groups mad at you be under 5%, so their bonuses and malices don't apply. So, for example, these guys are super angry, but we are not running the penalty because they are marginalized. And then, this is kind of a way to think about if you're trying to min-max what your government looks like, you can do this. It's easier to min-max what your government looks like if you have a lot of authority, which we'll come back to in a second. And then let's quickly look through the landowners. This is minus tax income for agriculture, ranching, and plantations. So if you have an economy that's primarily agrarian, getting these guys mad at you is really bad. If you have an economy that's primarily industrial, these guys basically don't matter. For family ties, it's influence. Okay, that's something. It's not nothing. It's something. And then you have aristocrats investment pool contribution. This is something I should probably test to see if they get any contribution. I think they get contribution. I think it's additive and not multiplicative. And so it's just 10% free investment pool contribution from the aristocrats. It's okay. It's not terrible, but again, I think that if the landowners are happy, generally speaking, the industrialists and the trade unionists will not be happy. I think the bonuses in both the industrialists and the trade unionists are stronger, and so in general I think that the best interest group to have really happy is the trade unionist, and they will be giving the manufacturing encourage manufacturing throughput bonus, or sorry, not that bonus but a different one, and workforce ratio, which is both of these are really good. So this is kind of the what's good about having a really high approval rating, which a lot of the laws in here will affect. And so that's why I thought it was important to cover this before we started talking about it. Now let's talk about authority. Authority kind of has 4 uses. The first is when you are running an authority bonus, you will pass laws faster. And when you are running a deficit, you will get opposition group interest approval ratings. So all these groups in the opposition are less happy with us because we are running negative authority. And notice it's actually minus 5.3. So this Intelligentsia, we would be getting this bonus if we just got rid of all of our negative authority. So this is important to note here, that this is it makes a bit of a big deal, but this is what you get for having an authority balance that's either positive or negative. Second thing you can do spend on authority is you can put in a lot of consumption taxes. Now, the consumption taxes will generate a lot of revenue based on how much your pops consume. Generally speaking, this means having larger populations that have a lot of consumption will make a big deal. You'll notice if you have an economy or a very large population, that something like liquor will have a large consumption tax, and the reason why is you have a bunch of people in, what's it called? Subsidy farms or subsistence farms. And the subsistence farms, well, we have no more subsistence. Oh, here we go. The subsistence farms notably produce liquor and services, and so taxing these, generally speaking, on really high population economy that is not well developed yet will actually yield a reasonable amount. And so this is one use for the consumption taxes. Generally speaking, as the game progresses, you start getting more from income tax than you do from consumption taxes. So you start getting more from income, dividend taxes, and, you know, minting than you are from consumption taxes. So consumption taxes tend to fall off as the game progresses. And the third thing you can use authority on, and this is probably one of the ones that's better early on, is you can either bolster or suppress interest groups. Now, when you bolster an interest group, they start gaining more clout, and when you suppress it, they start losing clout. We cannot do this right now because we have the laws of... Wait, why can't we do... Oh, because we don't have the authority, but we do have outlawed dissent. Now, just a quick note on this, how effective it is. The higher up you are on this, the more the suppression and bolster will matter, and the lower you are on this, the less it will matter, or you can't even do it with protected speech. With rights of assembly, you have a smaller impact on suppressing and bolstering. Now, the main reason why suppressing and bolstering is good for just getting certain guys out of the government, but also, if you want to micromanage it, you can try and make sure that clout stays at 20%, so you have as many powerful interest groups as possible in order to reap the double bonus, and you can also do it to make sure that the interest groups that hate you are below the 5% for the marginalized interest groups. So this is kind of a big deal. And the last thing we need to talk about is, clout before going into it, but just kind of briefly touch on clout. Clout determines how much legitimacy you have, and is calculated based on the laws, and so depending on which laws you have, this will influence how clout is calculated, but it contributes a lot to legitimacy. The legitimacy will be calculated based on clout, as well as coherence of the government based on which laws you have. So this is kind of all the background features we need to talk about to understand why a lot of these power structure laws are best or worst, or what have you. Okay, now let's talk about governance principles, which is the first one. Okay, so as a general heuristic, higher up, you get more authority, and lower down, you get less authority. This also changes how the government's calculated, and also, with monarchy, your ruler does not change. With the rest of these, your ruler will change, based on elections. If you also have, if you have autocracy or oligarchy, I believe your ruler does not change, but this is just kind of a quick feature. If you have presidential republic, your ruler will change, I believe, even if you still have autocracy or oligarchy. I'm not sure. I think I actually always pass landed voting or one of these first, so I haven't tested this explicitly, and it might be the case that as soon as you have voting, your ruler changes. Unless you have monarchy, in which case your ruler does not change. Okay. So let's get into it. You get increased authority, a lot of authority, 200, and increased landowners' political strength. Generally speaking, at the start of the game, early on, you want to ditch monarchy, but you don't want to ditch it right away because you are getting 20 legitimacy from having the head of state and government. This is generally paired alongside autocracy, which also gives legitimacy from having the head of state and government. And so you kind of gotta have an awkward situation where you have one and not the other, and you have some issues with having a high legitimacy, which again is going to affect how many radicals you have in a lot of ways, and also interest group approval rating. If you take a look, having a lot of loyalists gives you just a lot of approval rating, so it's something that's good to cultivate. And okay, so switching off of monarchy, though, is generally good because it disempowers the landowners and it allows you to have a government that has more people in it. Then we have presidential republic and also parliamentary republic. These are the two republics. The presidential republic gives you a lot more authority, but you have a government ideology penalty, and then this allows you to have a larger government with parliamentary republic. If you're trying to pass laws, Parliamentary republic is generally better because you can have more people in government at once, you can have a bigger coalition, and you can also generally have higher legitimacy. Is a little bit easier to achieve with Parliamentary republic because you do have the +1 government size allowance. This will allow you to have more people, more interest groups in the government without running penalties. And then we also, presidential republic will also increase the government ideology penalty. And so, you know, it's a bit of a trade-off. You get 20 legitimacy from votes for both. And then we have Theocracy. Theocracy I haven't played around with too much. It also gives 200 authority, and the same as Monarchy. And it also gives 25% Catholic Church political strength, much like Monarchy, for the landowners. So if you are trying to run a a government where you're trying to have the Catholic Church or whatever interest group powerful, that's the religion one, you know, where you're trying to run this authority and this birth rate up, you can do this, but generally speaking, you know, you're going to want a government or be playing a country that has a really large population that's not necessarily very productive for this to be particularly good. It also gives legitimacy from head of state and government ideology penalty. It's basically the exact same as Monarchy, just for the church instead of the landowners. So, okay. And then we have Council Republic, which is actually it's way different than the other ones. And this introduces a new production method on all of your buildings that you have to use. You're forced into it. It also gives plus government size allowance, minus government ideology penalty, so it'll be easy to have high legitimacy with this, and it'll give political strength of farmers and machinists. Now, what this production method does is it is the workers' cooperative, which gets rid of any capitalists or landowners anywhere in your economy. And this does something pretty significant. Instead, you get machinists and laborers, which are primarily trade unionists. And these ones are also, yeah, they're mainly trade unionists in this particular government, but this is going to change depending on, you know, your Clout situation in your government. But they will both be primarily trade unionists. Once you switch over to Council Republic, it is very hard to switch off of it because it gets rid of most of the industrialists. And you have to look at Council Republic in the same way or alongside both laissez-faire and like you with your economic system, because laissez-faire gives an investment pool contribution from capitalists. If there are no capitalists, there's no contribution. Agrarianism does the same for aristocrats, but if there are no aristocrats, there's no contribution. So generally speaking, this is going to be late game sort of law that you want to pass with the Council Republic, because you will lose out on your investment pool transfer that allows you to build a lot in the mid game, in the early to mid game, and instead what you will get is you will get a complete deleting of the upper strata. In this particular playthrough, we just recently passed Council Republic, and you'll notice our upper strata are actually doing worse than our lower strata. So it completely gets rid of the upper strata. And what it instead does is you have a more flat distribution of wealth in your economy, which will raise the average standard of living quite a bit because you don't have these people siphoning off a huge amount. And what this will do is it will allow you to attract more migrants very, very easily. And instead of leaning on your investment pool contribution for money, you lean on your taxes for money. Generally speaking, as you transition to the late game and you are using the investment pool contribution, you can lower the taxes to like the lowest level possible and still be doing all right. And then you will need to increase it if you put in Council Republic. Overall, I think this law is very strong late game if you somehow don't have a really high percentage of the world population, because you can use it to increase your standard of living and use it to get a bunch of migrants to get more workers. This is why I think it's good. But Presidential Republic and Parliamentary Republic are both pretty good. Presidential Republic, because it's giving authority, will be better earlier on in the game, and then as you transition to a later period in the game, it gets worse. I forgot to mention the fourth thing you can use authority on, which is you can put down edicts. In my mind, there's decrees. In my mind, the only one that's particularly good is encouraging manufacturing, which just gives you plus 20% or plus 20% manufacturing throughput bonus on all your buildings in the area. If you notice, we have a huge throughput bonus here. We have 50% from economies of scale, 20% from encouraging manufacturing, and 20% from the trade unions. Okay. Also, if you're watching my Luxembourg spoilers, this is how the run ends. Okay, so this is all the governance principles kind of things, all wrapped into one. And then let's talk about next let's talk about which distribution of power is best and why it's best and like these sorts of things. You start off with autocracy. Autocracy gives the most authority, and then you have these three: oligarchy, landed voting, and wealth voting, which all give the same authority but calculate clout differently. And then you have census suffrage, which gives a little bit of authority, and a universal suffrage, no authority, and then anarchy, which I just think is bad. We decided to ruin our economy and our government in this run, so we have anarchy. But let's take a quick look at autocracy. You get legitimacy from the head of state and government. You have a huge ideology penalty, so it's hard to have a coalition government. And you get a lot of legitimacy from government clout. And so having high clout is particularly important. And it also gives political strength to aristocrats, so it's kind of hard to break off of early game for a lot of really agrarian starting societies, but if you have like no agriculture, it's really easy to come off of. Importantly, landed voting is probably the most important law for transitioning. Now, the reason why is that landowners will support autocracy and they will be okay switching to landed voting, but they'll hate everything else. And so early on, when you have a really high clout landowners, landed voting is really good for transitioning. And what landed voting does is it gives political strength based on votes, and it votes of, you know, aristocrats, capitalists, clergymen, and officers. So this kind of spreads the power out amongst aristocrats, capitalists, clergymen, and officers. Notably, they've been changing the distribution of power quite a bit over the past few patches. This now gives plus 50 political strength to the aristocrats, where it used to only give plus 25, and plus 25 for all the others. Now you get legitimacy primarily from government clout, but also a little bit from votes. As you start moving down the chain, you'll notice you start getting more from votes and less from government clout. And so it becomes more important to have the government that wins the election in the government. You will have voting, though, once you have landed voting and elections. Oligarchy, you will not have voting. But let's quickly go through this. It gives plus government size allowance. Again, easier to build a coalition. Coalitions are nice because they give you, you know, more. If we take a look, you incur a penalty from having the opposition, so having groups in the opposition. So if you have more in the government, they don't incur that penalty to intergroup approval. And also, you can try and pass laws according to who's in your coalition. Okay, let's get back into it. So, oligarchy is actually an interesting one. In the past few patches, I think oligarchy was way stronger, and they've been nerfing it repeatedly. It used to give more authority. You get legitimacy from having the head of state and government. You get +2 for government size allowances, so it allows you to kind of have whoever's the monarch plus the industrialist is kind of generally the setup for oligarchy for, you know, having high legitimacy. And then it gives minus from government ideology penalty, plus 120 legitimacy from government clout. So it's all about clout, and then it gives increased political strength to both aristocrats and capitalists. Notice there's no legitimacy from voting. There's no voting in an oligarchy, so if you have an oligarchy, monarchy, it's just going to stay the same one. I think technically if you have like an autocracy, presidential republic, which I've never run before, because it's kind of easier to go for landed voting first and then transition off of this. If you do this, I think it's just like a military dictator who is a president. Hi, Putin. Okay, now, that's actually a kleptocracy. Now, we have wealth voting, which, notice, it's more political strength from, or it's a kind of similar amount of political strength from votes, but less from the government clout. If we take a look, this is 100 legitimacy from government clout. This is 120. This is, I think, 120 as well. And then this is only 75 legitimacy from government clout, and it gives increased legitimacy from votes. And wealth voting will allow you to kind of have a lot of clout kind of centered on the industrialists early on. And also you can do it with the Intelligentsia. You can overpay them here and kind of pump it up. But as your standard of living rises, that threshold kind of eventually comes to include everyone. And once it includes everyone, your government's a little bit less coherent. And so when your standard of living is kind of lowish, wealth voting is a good way for having a very coherent government, because only people from like certain interest groups will be able to vote. But as everyone gains access to voting because they get enough wealth voting tends to fall off and be not as good. You get +1 government size allowance, plus 20% ideology penalty, and Okay, so generally speaking, this wealth penalty is the standard of living. So when everyone starts getting over 25 or near 25, when you start getting the peasants at 25, you know, the interest groups that you are trying to suppress at 25, wealth voting gets bad. And this is because the legitimacy you have from votes and government clout, it's not quite enough. So then we have census suffrage, which again kind of gates you in a similar way to wealth voting, but instead it's political strength from literate pops votes, and also the wealth threshold is lower, but if you take a look, you get more legitimacy from the government votes, and the total legitimacy, so if you take a look here, it's going to be around 140, right? Because 75 plus 65, and this transitions it to be more from the votes. So as long as you have whatever voting bloc in power, you will have higher legitimacy. Voting blocks, as soon as you pass any type of voting, you'll get government parties. So for example, we don't have parties. We don't have parties because we're in anarchy. I was going to show you what parties we had, but we stopped having them once we passed anarchy, which is interesting to note. So anarchy, oligarchy, and autocracy, you will not have parties. As long as you have the party in government, it is easier to have higher legitimacy with census suffrage than wealth voting later on in the game, when it becomes harder to keep people off the voting. And then we have universal suffrage, which, notice, is starting to decrease authority each one. Universal suffrage is the first one to have 0 authority. You get plus 20 political strength from votes, and only votes. Now, it's important to note that people will not be politically active if they are more poor, or if they are less literate. They tend not to be as politically active, and also if they are a suppressed or oppressed minority, this will also do that. We have government size allowance, plus 1, 25 legitimacy from government clout, which is the lowest by far. So it really doesn't matter how legitimate, it doesn't really matter how much clout there is. It just matters how many votes there are. And so once you pass universal suffrage, as long as you just stick in whoever won the election into the government, your government will be fairly legitimate. And so a big reason to move off of these really high authority distribution of power laws and onto universal suffrage, it will be easier to have a high legitimacy. Now, if you're running a ton of loyalists and very few radicals anyways, stay on these higher ones because the authority. But if you need to if you're starting to run into problems here, you can switch on to universal suffrage. Anarchy is just bad. It gives you minus 50% authority, plus 1 universal pop political strength. Notice this isn't from votes. And minus 75 political strength from wealth, and increased government size, and you just get 100 flag legitimacy from government clout. So there's no voting. You just put in people for the clout. What it will do though is it will be just whichever, if we take a look, it's all from government clout, and it will very quickly represent who there is. And so, what's the best way to put this? When you are just getting plus 1 political strength, just flat and not from votes, it will only matter what the population looks like in terms of the workers, what your profession is. And if we have a ton of laborers and machinists, we're just going to have an enormous amount of trade unionists. And if we take a look at profession, that's what we got. We also have clerks, which are Intelligentsia, and trade unionists. And so we will have a very coherent government, but mainly on the back of the trade unionists just becoming incredibly powerful. And also on the back of, everyone becomes a trade unionist or a peasant or intelligentsia or what have you, and then they're all super happy with you, and then you just have really, really high clout, and then that makes your government legitimate. We haven't really gotten to transition too much because we just switched on to anarchy, but if you take a look at the clout, how it's moving, you'll see that it's going to increase over here. And maybe a revolution. Yikes. Okay. So that is distribution of power in a nutshell. Anarchy sucks. Don't do it. This minus 50% authority is pretty bad. Notably, it's not anywhere near as bad if you don't have anything else adding to authority, because this is a percentage, it's a multiplicative modifier. The more authority you have, the worse anarchy is. The less you have, the less bad it is. I don't think you ever really need... If you really, really need to juice up the the trade unions and you can't figure out a way to make them powerful any other way, I guess it's okay, but it's not okay. what it does do is it unlocks some event chains in terms of like what's positive, but okay. So now let's go into citizenship. And citizenship and religion should be looked at kind of at the same time and in the same way, because at the very top we have stuff like ethnostate, which the big benefit of it is it gives authority, but it makes pops discriminated. When you have multiculturalism, it just makes no one's discriminated against. With ethnostate, you also get minus radicals for standard living decreases in accepted cultures, and plus loyalists from from standard living increases in accepted cultures. Okay, so why would you? So other than the increased radicals and loyalists, and so it seems like it's mainly upside, and it's like, well, so why do you want multiculturalism then? Because this isn't giving us anything. But what multiculturalism does is it makes all pops accepted, so you won't get a bunch of radicals from not accepted pops. In this game, the migration is just super overtuned. And so if you do not have a really, really large population, you don't want to be on ethnostate, national supremacy, racial segregation, or cultural exclusion. Unless you like do a world conquest and everyone is your own ethnicity, then maybe you switch back to ethnostate or something like this. But as long as you want migration, you really want to be on multiculturalism, total separation, and no migration controls. This will increase the amount of migrants coming into your economy, and then once they come in, they won't radicalize from being discriminated against. And so, just generally speaking, you want to move to multiculturalism, and you want to move to total separation for migration reasons. Now let's take a look at bureaucracy, which is... Okay, let's get into it. So for hereditary bureaucrats, this gives it gives minus 25% bureaucracy population cost modifier and increased landowner strength. And this one is only good if you have a really, really high population, and most of your bureaucracy cost is coming from the population cost modifier. As you switch over to, well, generally speaking, you kind of want to be on appointed bureaucrats in the early game, and then late game elected bureaucrats gets better. So appointed bureaucrats gives plus intelligentsia political strength. Intelligentsia is a nice group to have strong, whereas this one, the final one, gives plus 25 Petite Bourgeoisie political strength, which I feel generally is not as good, but let's take a look. It also gives plus 25% taxation capacity, which allows you to... Kind of as you get into the super late game, you have a good way to think about this is institutions, okay? And what is costing all your bureaucracy. Early on in the game, when you don't have a lot of institutions, what you're mainly going to care about is having enough bureaucracy to cover the population cost, which for our government is only 500 out of this 4.5k. So having something like hereditary bureaucrats would be terrible because it's just doing the bureaucracy population cost modifier. It would only save us like 125 bureaucracy. If you take a look at what we're paying mostly on, is it's all of our institutions, like law enforcement level 3 is 441, colonial affairs 350. This is already more than the population cost modifier, and then we have a ton more, okay? And so elected bureaucrats is going to, appointed bureaucrats, instead what it does is it increases taxation capacity. If you have really, really large populations, appointed bureaucrats is pretty good, because you will not be hitting, you will be running, let's see, you will have insufficient taxation capacity in some of your places, and this will help deal with the insufficient taxation capacity. So appointed bureaucrats tends to be better in large populations, but eventually you turn a corner when you have so many institutions that elected bureaucrats gets better, because this gives minus 15% bureaucracy institution cost multiplier. And so this will make all of your institutions cheaper. Now, this is kind of a good way to think about it is if you are having to overbuild, if you are not running any insufficient taxation capacity notifications, then you will probably want to switch to elected bureaucrats if you are still having to build government administrations. And the reason for this is that, you know, the petite bourgeoisie not the petite bourgeoisie. You're no longer building for the taxation capacity, you're just building for the raw institution cost, and so being on elected bureaucrats will be better. Also, this will something to kind of note is you get a bonus from in your capital from having the skyscraper. When you eventually build the skyscraper, this is just something to note. And so just building a ton of government admins in the capital makes some sense because you get a bonus, and being on appointed bureaucrats and doing that is like slightly better. But overall, elected bureaucrats is eventually what you want to transition into. Although if you just stayed on appointed bureaucrats forever and you were just like, I don't like this bourgeoisie political strength modifier, that's somewhat reasonable too. Okay, so for army models, they recently changed this in patch 1.1, in patch 1.1, adding kind of an element that's pretty important, and that's the morale loss. If you want to minimize morale loss, professional army is best. Peasant levies is worst. Peasant levies will give increased landowner political strength, and in general this is kind of the worst law, but I believe this is new with the decreased military goods costs because the landowners are paying for it, and so this in theory will allow you to field the largest and most powerful army in terms of power projection. We hover over here, we see we have power projection of 3136. This law will allow you to have the largest power projection possible if you just want to have a big stick. But other than that, in terms of actually fighting, I think the morale loss is more important, and the barracks max level is also really, really nice. Now, this is kind of a good way to think about it, and also, if you are playing a really small country that's going to be really rich, being able to go up to level 100 barracks is a pretty big deal. And also, you can build it up in the capital, which the capital, when you have a revolution, as long as you're not a single state country, you always keep a hold of the capital. So having professional army, strategically speaking, is very nice because you can just build up 100 units in the capital, and then you will, generally speaking, win revolutions unless you have an enormous military. And so this is a nice thing about this, but also it's mainly the morale loss. It also gives political strength to armed forces, which this is something you could care about or you could not care about. But if you're not going to build a military, professional army isn't necessarily best. I kind of use it for all of my runs, but let's talk about the other two. You have national militia, which allows you to have, it only has, this is really important to note, +5 barracks max level, so you can only build barracks to level 5. So this is going to keep you off of having a standing army, but instead it gives +100 conscription max level, and it gives a very high conscription rate, and so what you will have is you will have an army of conscripts. So if you are not going to be fighting, but you just want to have a high defensive capacity, national militia is very good. Generally speaking, in Victoria 3, you have a situation where the AI doesn't attack you very much unless you're Mexico and you're playing against the United States, and so because you have this situation where you can pick and fight your battles, national militia isn't that good. If the AI was more aggressive about expansion and fighting you, and there were like other war goals they could have other than conquering you that were like good for them, and they were just like aggressive and pushed it more, national militia would be much, much better because it is really good for being defensive and not having to pay a lot for your military. So having a high defensive capacity while having a low military cost. But generally speaking, you kind of reach a point in Victoria 3 where you just want to have a military and then just always be using it and just picking on small little countries that can't fight back. And so I don't really like national militia that much, but I could see an argument for it, especially in PvP. Mass conscription is an interesting one because it has +100 barracks max level and +100 conscription center max level. If for whatever reason you are stuck on a 1 or 2 state country and you need to have a huge military, so for example, let's say you were playing like Krakow or Wallachia, and you needed to declare war on like Austria for whatever reason, something like this. This would be a reasonable law to pass on a temporary basis. It gives you more morale loss. You do not have the cheaper military. You also don't have, I think, as high a conscription rate. Yeah, so national militia has a slightly higher conscription rate, so you'll have more conscripts with the national militia and a better morale loss thing. But mass conscription, what it does is if you're going to have a huge standing army and a huge conscript basis, this lets you do it. And it also has increased training rate, which is it's okay, but like you can't like pass mass conscription on a dime. But if you want to scrape the bottom of the barrel and have as many troops as possible, mass conscription's good. So I think it's probably good in PvP. I haven't played much PvP. And it's also really good if you're just, for whatever reason, on a 1 or 2 state country and you have an economy that can support a professional army over 100 or 200 barracks, but you just can't get that army. Mass conscription makes sense. But for the most part, professional army is best. Also, early on, you kind of want to switch off of peasant levies because, generally speaking, you're trying to disempower the landowners. Okay, and the last up, we have internal security. Generally speaking, I think guaranteed liberties is best, but we'll quickly go over all of them. No home affairs. The big advantage of this is you don't have to pay for the institution. Currently, so this is an institution for this. We are paying, in this country, 147 bureaucracy for each level, which is incurring us a cost, and so if you wanted to do no home affairs, that would make sense. The cost of these institutions is based on population, so if you are in a really high population country, like China is probably the best example, staying on known home affairs for a long time could make perfect sense. But once you are selecting one, you have to select from one of these. National Guard, the main advantage of National Guard is you don't really need new tech, or there isn't much barrier to entry to put it in, and so this is reasonable type of law to pass early on when you don't have the tech or the prerequisite for, so you have to have rights of assembly or protected speech in order to get guaranteed liberties. A National Guard you can pass, and what this gives is increased conscription rate. Again, if you are on one of these conscription strategies, it actually is, this is a reasonable law to have for that reason. But from what I was saying earlier, you never really need a high conscription rate because the AI doesn't really pick on you as much as they probably ought to. The revolution, secession progress speed, I don't think this modifier is particularly good. And so it's, I think in general, you want to avoid sparking revolutions or secessions, and you want to avoid radicalism. And so the better way to do this is to be encouraging loyalists and decreasing radicals over time. And I think that these modifiers aren't as good. But National Guards, it's okay. It's better than nothing if you have a very, very small country where the institutions are very, very cheap. Okay, next we have Secret Police, which is decent in a strategy where you're doing a lot of suppressing or bolstering. It gives, let's see, minus 25% suppression impact on interest group attraction. So people, if you are suppressing, it will attract less interest groups, is my understanding of how this works. It also gives minus revolution, secession, progression speed, and minus radicalism on political movements, so you're just cracking down. But it's not giving you any loyalists or decreasing radicals itself. It's only decreasing radicals from political movements. If you have guaranteed libs, however, this also gives minus 50% revolution, secession, progression speech, but gives decreased radicals from standard of living decreases and increased loyalists from standard of living increases. I think guaranteed liberties is very strong, especially if your government or your standard of living is kind of oscillating like this, because as it goes down, you lose less, and when it comes back up, you gain more, etc. And so it's good for having a really high balance of, you know, radicals to loyalists, which is better than, you know, having decreased political movement radicalism. If we take a look here, you'll see this plus approval rating is pretty big in terms of applying to all of the interest group bonuses we talked about earlier. You know, this is a huge driver of us actually being able to have the bonuses, because some of these people don't like the laws we have, but they're happy with how the economy is, basically, and so they tolerate it. And so this is why they have a lot of approval, except for the ones that are really mad at us, like the Industrialists. But they're mad because we passed a bunch of laws they don't like. Like, they don't like the switch to Council Republic type of stuff. But let's get back to the law. Guaranteed liberties is going to be the best for, you know, getting loyalists and radicals. The disadvantage of guaranteed liberties is you have to get down to rights of assembly and protected speech, which this is a discussion for another time. The main benefit, though, is protected speech gives you more tech spread, outlawed dissent gives you more authority, and it's just kind of like a sliding scale. Once you research all the text, though, outlawed dissent is great. So this is kind of the power structure that I think is best overall, and we'll just quickly run through it. Overall, I think the best for the government is presidential republic. The super late game council republic can be good, but it's also like super committal and you can't switch off of it. Yeah, and council republic forces you into a PM that's not very good early game, but is very strong late game, which is under certain conditions, which is the worker cooperative, which has machinists and laborers instead of capitalists. Okay, for distribution of power early on, I think oligarchy can actually be decent, but for the most part, you're going to eventually want to transition to universal suffrage, kind of, with a bit of an asterisk. As long as you can maintain a legitimate government, you kind of want to keep up here in oligarchy, landed voted, or wealth voting. But once it starts being harder to maintain legitimacy, you kind of want to switch over to universal suffrage. And this is for the increased legitimacy, which is going to give you more loyalists from standard living increases. Staying inside legitimate governments so that you don't get any penalty is kind of nice. But it's maybe not the biggest deal. A bigger part of why, these are going to be better is also has to do with how authority in terms of its usefulness falls off as the game goes on. For this, I just think multiculturalism is best. You know, it's especially, even if you're conquering nations, you have like Ethnostate and you conquer nations, they'll all be super radical when you conquer. And yeah, the migration is just too strong in this game. I think it's best to just go multiculturalism, total separation. And because you're going total separation, you probably don't want to have a government with a really strong religion. You know, it's conceivable you could go state religion combined with theocracy, and this is actually probably decent in some runs and ways, but I don't think, I think migration is just too good for anything but these two laws to be considered best. Elected bureaucrats is best in the long run, depending on population considerations. If you have really, really large populations, appointed bureaucrats could be better. In terms of political strength, Intelligentsia is better to empower, I think, than Petite Bourgeoisie, so there's an argument for staying on appointed bureaucrats if you need it for the Intelligentsia political strength. I think professional army is best in PvE. In PvP, mass conscription might be best. If the AI gets updated in 1.2 to be much more aggressive, national militia you can make a strong argument for. If you don't want to yet have a standing army, it's national militia is going to be better, and then you can switch to professional army if you want. I rather just pass professional army and then not worry about it. Maybe the min-maxing way is to go from peasant levies to national militia, and then once you decide you want to turn a corner and start beating up on small nations, switching to professional army. But okay, and then I just think guaranteed liberties is just way stronger than the rest of these, except for no home affairs if you have a really large population and you can't afford the institution at all. Guaranteed liberties gives you loyalists, gets rid of radicals, which gives you interest group approval rating, which gives you the bonuses we started out at the start. You know, talking about these. Very quickly, I think the strongest of the bonuses to have are the trade unionists for their solidarity, their workforce ratio, and their manufacturing industries throughput. This increased throughput will make industries more profitable, which will increase the amount that they can pay the workers, and this also increase the numbers of people who can work. So this is very good for driving attraction. This combined with the Intelligentsia decreased society cost, and more importantly, the increased migration attraction is very strong. I think if you're making a block of, you know, people you want to create, be very, very powerful and a part of the government and, you know, that you're trying to harvest bonuses from, the two best are Intelligentsia and trade unionists, and maybe third is the Industrialists, because the decreased production tech cost and the increased investment pool contribution are a pretty big deal. But hard to have industrialists and trade unionists get along. But if you can have plus 10 on both of them and maintain this balance and keep all three of these above 20%, I think that is probably the best thing you could do. And so you want to be thinking about, you know, having where these guys' clouts are when you're thinking of which laws to pass here. You know, trying to massage the clout a little bit if you are trying to min-max, absolutely. This video has gotten quite long. Hopefully it was informative in terms of what power structures are best and also how to think about which power structures are going to be best. you know, you notice a lot of it's like situational and it's this sort of thing. Next up, we're probably going to do, or next week or later on, we're probably going to do this for economy as well. So stay tuned for that video. If you have any requests on anything you want tutorials on, please put it in the comments, because I don't know what people might be struggling with or thinking about other than this government, which is unacceptable. Yeah, this run is cursed. I just detonated the run and then I'm like, I'm done. See you later. Peace out. But feel free to like, comment, subscribe. You know, the YouTube algorithm stuff. It does help out. And have a good day. Also, if you've been sitting for this entire duration of this, maybe get up, take a walk, get a glass of water, this sort of thing. Good for your health. Get your heart rate up just a little bit. You know, walking's hyper underrated and sitting's overrated. Yeah.